Imagine waking up one morning. Just yesterday your savings were enough to buy a house. Today they can barely buy a loaf of bread. Your paycheck hits your bank account. But before you even have a chance to spend it, it's already losing value. People aren't carrying cash in their wallets anymore. They're pushing it around in wheelbarrows. It sounds like something straight out of a disaster movie, doesn't it? But this isn't fiction. Millions of people have lived through exactly this. It's called hyperinflation, and it's happened far more often than most people realize. Most of us think of money as something permanent, something stable, something we can always rely on. We assume that the cash in our pocket today will still have roughly the same value tomorrow, but history tells a very different story. The worst episodes of hyperinflation didn't just wipe out bank accounts. They brought governments to their knees, they tore families apart, and in some cases, they changed the course of history. Hyperinflation spread through entire societies like a wildfire, burning away savings, destroying trust, and exposing just how fragile an economy can become, because once people stop believing in their money, the entire system begins to crack. In this video, we're going to look at 5 countries. 5 real economies that watched their currencies collapse into almost nothing. And more importantly, we'll see what that collapse actually cost the people living through it. But before we begin, keep one thing in mind. Inflation rarely announces itself with a bang. It doesn't kick the door down, it creeps in quietly. Little by little, almost unnoticed. And by the time most people realize what's happening, it's already too late. Let's begin with one of the most infamous financial disasters in modern history. Germany, 1923. The Weimar Republic. World War I had ended, but for Germany, the real struggle was only beginning. The country was drowning in debt. Under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forced to pay more than 132 billion gold marks in war reparations, an almost unimaginable burden, one that could have taken generations to repay. So what did the government do? It chose what seemed like the easiest solution. It printed more money, a lot more. At first, everything appeared to be under control. Life went on. Most people had no idea what was coming. Then prices doubled, then they tripled. And before long, everything spiraled completely out of control. By November of 1923, the German mark had become practically worthless. A single loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. Just imagine that for a second, one loaf of bread. People started burning stacks of banknotes just to keep warm, because in many cases, the paper itself was worth more than the money printed on it. Children played with bundles of cash as if they were toys, and middle-class families watched a lifetime of savings disappear in a matter of weeks. But the biggest loss wasn't financial, it was trust. People stopped believing in the system itself, because once a society loses faith in its currency, everything else begins to fall apart. Trade slows down, savings become meaningless, salaries lose their value, contracts stop feeling reliable one by one. The foundations holding the economy together begin to crumble, and eventually the crisis is no longer just economic, it becomes social. People lose hope, frustration grows, chaos spreads. And in times like these, extremist ideas often find fertile ground. Just 10 years later, Adolf Hitler rose to power. Hyperinflation wasn't the only reason, but Germany's economic collapse became one of the key conditions that made his rise possible. Now let's fast forward about 80 years. Our next stop, Zimbabwe. The early 2000s, Robert Mugabe's government was under enormous pressure. International sanctions, economic isolation, and a rapidly shrinking economy were pushing the country deeper into crisis. Then came massive land seizures. Some of Zimbabwe's most productive farmland changed hands almost overnight. Agricultural output collapsed. And one of the country's most important industries was suddenly on the brink of failure. So how did the government respond? You can probably guess they printed more money again. And just like that, the same cycle that history had seen so many times before began all over again. By 2008, Zimbabwe's inflation rate was estimated to have reached 79.6 billion%. It's almost impossible to wrap your head around a number like that. Prices weren't doubling every month or every week. They were doubling every 24 hours. Something you bought today could cost twice as much tomorrow. The government's answer: keep printing, more bills, more zeros, more money that was worth less every single day, 10 million, $100 billion, $100 trillion banknotes. They became part of everyday life, but the more zeros the government added, the less those notes were actually worth. Eventually, reality caught up with them. Zimbabwe's currency had become virtually useless. So the country abandoned its own dollar, and people turned to foreign currencies like the US dollar and the South African rand instead. But the real question is, what was the cost? It wasn't just worthless banknotes, it was people's lives. Retirement savings disappeared. Businesses shut down. Factories closed. Entire industries collapsed, and millions of Zimbabweans had no choice but to leave their country in search of a future somewhere else. The people who survived the crisis weren't the ones with the biggest bank accounts. They were the ones who owned real assets, land practical skills, businesses, things that still had value, even after the currency didn't, because when money dies, real value is all that's left. Now let's go back even further. Our next stop, Hungary, 1946. Many economists consider this the worst case of hyperinflation ever recorded. World War II had left Hungary in ruins. Its economy was devastated, its industries were broken, its government was nearly bankrupt. At the time, the country used a currency called the pengo to rebuild the nation and pay for the enormous costs of the war. The government did what so many governments before it had done. It started printing money. On a massive scale, before long things spiraled completely out of control. Prices were doubling every 15 hours. Think about that. Something you bought in the morning could cost twice as much before the day was over. Inflation eventually reached 1.9 quadrillion %, a number so large it barely feels real. That's a 4, followed by 16 zeros. Numbers stopped making sense. The pengo became so worthless that the government kept introducing larger and larger banknotes. First came the milpengo, worth 1 million, pengo. Then came the B, pengo, worth 1 billion, pengo. Every new note carried more zeros than the last. But nothing changed. No matter how much money they printed, they couldn't stop the collapse. Eventually, the government gave up. The pengo was abandoned completely, and Hungary introduced an entirely new currency, the forint, a fresh start, at least on paper. For ordinary people, it was already too late. They hadn't just lost money, they had lost years of hard work, their savings, their security, and in many cases, their hope for the future. Hungary's middle class was almost completely wiped out. Savings accounts became meaningless overnight, and whatever trust people still had in their government was gone. Because hyperinflation doesn't just erase wealth, it erases time, years of work, years of sacrifice can disappear almost overnight. Now let's head to South America. Our next stop, Venezuela, from the 2010s to the present day. A country sitting on some of the largest oil reserves on Earth, rich in natural resources. Yet somehow its economy became one of the biggest financial disasters of the modern era. Years of corruption, government price controls nationalized industries, and reckless monetary policies gradually turned one of Latin America's wealthiest nations into one of the world's clearest warnings about economic collapse. To cover budget deficits, the government printed money to fund failing public programs. It printed more money. To keep the economy alive, it printed even more. And just like every country we've talked about so far, the outcome never changed. Inflation exploded. By 2018, Venezuela's inflation rate had climbed past 1 million %. It's hard to picture a number like that, so think of it this way. You get paid in the morning, and if you don't spend that money today, it could be worth significantly less tomorrow. People weren't rushing to the supermarket because they wanted to shop. They were racing against inflation, trying to buy something before their money lost even more value. Store shelves were empty. Basic necessities became harder and harder to find as confidence in the currency disappeared. Bartering made a comeback. Doctors, engineers, teachers, people with years of education left the country in search of a future elsewhere. Many of them ended up delivering food, driving taxis, or taking whatever work they could find just to survive. Meanwhile, the government kept doing the same thing, printing larger banknotes, adding more zeros, trying to solve the problem with the very thing that had caused it. Eventually, things became so absurd that Venezuela simply removed 6 zeros from its currency overnight. But removing zeros from banknotes didn't remove the damage. Hyperinflation hollowed out the economy from the inside, businesses disappeared, investment dried up, and millions of people stopped believing that tomorrow would be any better than today. Even the healthcare system began to collapse. Medicine became scarce. Hospitals struggled to function. and in the end millions of Venezuelans left their homes behind. Once again, the people who held real assets or had access to stable foreign currencies had a much better chance of making it through. Everyone else paid the price. Now let's look at a case that isn't talked about nearly as often, but deserves to be: Yugoslavia. The early 1990s. As the Soviet bloc collapsed, Yugoslavia was torn apart by war. The country fractured, its economy stalled, international sanctions followed, and years of political instability pushed the financial system over the edge. By 1993, monthly inflation had reached 313 million%. Prices were doubling every 1.4 days. Imagine walking into a store today and coming back 2 days later to find everything costs twice as much. That became normal. The government kept introducing new versions of the currency, each time promising, this one will fix the problem, but it never did. Every new currency wiped out the value of the old one. Years of savings disappeared. Again and again. Eventually, people stopped using their own money altogether. Instead, they relied on German marks and US dollars. Because trust in the local currency was gone, the official currency had become little more than paper. Some people use banknotes to light cigarettes, others use them as wallpaper, when money loses all credibility. Sometimes it's worth more as decoration than as currency, and if you've noticed something by now, it's this. Every one of these stories follows almost exactly the same pattern. A crisis begins. The government prints money to solve it. People lose confidence. The currency collapses. Society begins to fall apart. Different countries, different decades, the same mistake. At this point, you might be thinking, well, those were different times. That could never happen today. Our economies are much stronger now, but are they? Today, the world is carrying more debt than at any other point in modern history. The United States alone owes more than $34 trillion, and that number keeps growing. Over the past decade, central banks around the world created trillions of dollars in new money to stimulate the economy, to keep interest rates low, to support financial markets, to prevent recessions. At first, it seemed to work. Markets climbed, the economy recovered, asset prices soared, and life went on. Inflation stayed low for years. Growth continued. Everything seemed perfectly under control, until suddenly it wasn't. Then came 2021 and 2022, and the world changed after years of unusually low inflation. Prices started rising, at a pace most people hadn't seen in decades. Broken supply chains, the war in Ukraine, soaring energy prices, and yes, years of aggressive money printing. Together, they created the perfect storm. Suddenly, central banks found themselves fighting a completely different battle. Yesterday, they were printing money to support the economy. Today, they were trying to stop inflation. Interest rates rose rapidly. Markets became volatile. And the people who paid the highest price were often the same people who had benefited the least from years of cheap money. Rent became more expensive. Groceries cost more fuel. Electricity. Almost every part of daily life became noticeably more expensive. But wages didn't rise nearly as fast, and for the first time in years, people started asking questions that many had forgotten. What is money? Really? Who actually decides what it's worth? And what happens if people stop believing in it? Now, we're not living through hyperinflation today. But history teaches us something important. Major crises rarely begin with loud warning signs. They usually start quietly. The danger isn't just rising prices. Sometimes it's the way people start thinking. We can always print more money, we can always borrow more, the central bank will fix everything. History has heard those words before, and history doesn't have a great track record with them. People believe the same things. In Weimar Germany, in Zimbabwe, and Venezuela, the only real difference today is the scale. Never before has the global economy been this interconnected. Never before has it depended so heavily on debt or on the decisions of central banks, which means if confidence were ever seriously shaken, the consequences might not stop at one country. They could spread across the entire world, and that's exactly where this story becomes personal. You may not be able to influence the decisions of the Federal Reserve, or change the policies of the European Central Bank. But there are still things you can control. How you save, how you spend, how you invest, and most importantly, how you prepare. So what can we actually learn from history's 5 worst episodes of hyperinflation? The first lesson is simple: real wealth isn't the amount of money sitting in your bank account. Real wealth is your purchasing power. It's the land you own, the skills you've built, the businesses you create, the relationships you invest in, and your ability to adapt when the world changes. In every country we've covered, paper money eventually lost its value. But people who owned real assets, people with valuable skills, people who could create value outside the financial system had a much better chance of surviving the storm. The second lesson may be even more important. Trust is everything. Currencies don't collapse because the ink fades. They collapse because people stop believing in them. Money works because billions of people agree that it has value. The moment that agreement begins to disappear, the system starts breaking down. And history has shown us something over and over again. Trust can take decades to build, but it can disappear surprisingly fast. And once it's gone, winning it back can take years. The third lesson: inflation punishes the unprepared. It usually doesn't arrive overnight. It starts quietly, then it accelerates. And the people who suffer the most are often those living paycheck to paycheck. Governments may be able to reduce the burden of their debt through inflation, but you can't inflate away your grocery bill. That's why financial literacy isn't just about making more money, it's about protecting what you've already earned. So, how do you prepare? Start by understanding how the system actually works. Don't blindly accept every headline. Ask questions, learn how money is created, and learn what gives it value in the first place. Avoid unnecessary debt whenever you can, and don't rely on a single asset or a single source of income. Because diversification isn't just an investment strategy, it's a survival strategy. Maybe that means owning different types of assets. Maybe it means developing skills that remain valuable, no matter what happens to the economy. Or maybe it simply means building a lifestyle that's resilient enough to weather difficult times. And above all, never forget what inflation really is. It's more than rising prices. It's a silent transfer of purchasing power, one that often goes unnoticed until it's too late if you're not prepared for it. It can slowly erode your financial freedom without you even realizing it. The 5 hyperinflation disasters we've explored today didn't happen by accident. Behind every one of them were bad decisions, unsustainable debt wars, political failures, and one dangerous belief that you can create prosperity. Simply by printing more money, history has proven it doesn't work. Now you know what that cycle looks like. You've seen how it begins, how it grows, and how it ends. So the next time someone tells you that could never happen here, you'll remember. People have said those exact same words before. History doesn't repeat itself perfectly, but it often rhymes, and if we refuse to learn from it, we risk paying the same price in a different form. If you enjoyed this video and want to better understand the hidden forces shaping money history and power, consider subscribing to the channel. Because sometimes the best way to understand the future is to study the past. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.